The storm came in quietly that evening, one of those Colorado nights when the wind moves through the pines like a low hum, and every branch seems to cradle a little more weight than it did the hour before. It wasn't a dangerous storm, not yet. Just cold enough to make the animals pull closer to shelter, and cold enough that anything small, lost, or unlucky would not last long. But that night, under the muted glow of a porch light on the edge of Willow Crest Valley, a sound rose above the wind, so faint it could have been mistaken for a creaking board. A single, fragile cry, and it changed the course of two lives that had already suffered more than they ever should have. Lily froze when she heard it. She'd stepped outside only to shake off her boots after helping her grandmother close up the small cabin for the night. The kind of simple routine her family kept without thinking. But something in that thin, trembling sound tugged at her, like a memory brushing across the surface of her heart. She knelt beside the porch, lifting the edge of a drifting snowbank with her glove. And there he was. A newborn kitten, no larger than the palm of her hand, its white fur stiff with cold. He wasn't meowing so much as gasping, each breath looking like the beginning of a plea and the end of a hope all at once. Lily whispered, "Oh, sweetheart," her voice shaking in a way she didn't expect. Grief has a way of staying close, especially when it's quiet, especially when it's fresh. She had lost her old tabby, Milo, only 3 months earlier. 14 years of companionship, gone in a single autumn. Since then, her grandmother said she hadn't laughed the same, hadn't spoken the same. But Lily didn't talk about it, not once. Now she felt something inside her stir, an instinct, or maybe a memory of instinct. The kind that rises when a small life trembles in the cold. She scooped the kitten gently into her hands and rushed him inside, her breath forming clouds in the night air. Willow Crest Valley sits about 20 minutes from Willow Crest Sanctuary, a quiet wildlife rehabilitation center tucked against the northern Colorado foothills. Most locals know the place well. They know the older volunteers who brew coffee in the early hours. They know the smell of hay that clings to jackets. They know the sound of distant bobcat calls echoing across the ridge. And they know the sanctuary is often overwhelmed, caught in an endless tug between compassion and limited resources. Lily's grandmother didn't have to say a word. The look they exchanged told the whole story. He won't make it through the night unless someone steps in. Within minutes, they were on the road, snow brushing the windshield like scattered feathers. The kitten didn't move, wrapped in one of Lily's scarves. His breathing was shallow, uneven, so faint that Lily put her ear close just to hear it. Every time his chest rose, she held her breath. Every time it fell, she whispered a quiet encouragement, as if the words could warm him from the inside out. Years later, Lily would say she didn't remember making a decision that night. She simply knew she couldn't let him go. Not after losing Milo. Not after all those evenings when she sat alone in her room, hands empty, unsure what to hold on to next. Sometimes the heart reaches out before the mind catches up. They pulled into the sanctuary lot just after 9:30. Snow dusted the wooden sign, Willow Crest Wildlife Rehabilitation and Sanctuary, and the outdoor lights threw long shadows across the walkway. A few vehicles remained, belonging to the night staff. It was quiet, but not empty. Sanctuaries rarely sleep through storms. Dr. Bennett opened the door before Lily even knocked. He had one of those calm, steady faces shaped by years of long nights and harder decisions. When he saw the bundle in her arms, he didn't hesitate. He simply motioned her inside. The kitten was placed in an incubator immediately, warmth flowing over him like a second chance. Lily stood back, arms wrapped around herself as if trying to keep her hope from spilling. Dr. Bennett spoke softly. "He's ice cold, sweetheart, but it's a good sign he's still trying. Animals surprise us. They find strength in places we can't see." Lily nodded, though her jaw trembled. She wasn't just afraid of the kitten. She was afraid of losing something again. so soon after learning what loss feels like. Grief does that. It sharpens your awareness, makes you notice what's fragile, makes you hold your breath at the first sign of a miracle, and at the first sign of failure. For many people, especially those who've seen the world shift under their feet once or twice, the instinct to care can return, in moments that feel almost sacred. This kitten, small as he was, woke something in Lily. Something protective, something raw, something she thought she had lost when Milo died. But the sanctuary was carrying its own quiet grief that night. Just beyond the exam room, past a row of dim enclosures, lay a female bobcat named Sable. She had been brought in weeks earlier after being found near an old ranching road, dehydrated, malnourished, and heavily pregnant. The staff had done everything they could, but nature can be both beautiful and unforgiving. Sable's cub had been stillborn. She hadn't touched her food in 2 days. She hadn't made a sound in 3. And tonight she lay curled in her straw nest, the wind pressing softly against her enclosure walls, as if urging her to breathe a little deeper. People often think predators live on instinct alone, driven by survival, ruled by solitude. But loss doesn't care about species lines. It doesn't say, "You're wild, so you don't get to feel this." In sanctuaries across the country, staff see it all the time. The way a bereaved animal withdraws, the way they search their den or carry old bedding, the way their eyes soften in moments they once would have ignored. Sable had lost her purpose the same day she lost her baby. And on this night, as Lily watched the incubator's soft glow, 2 wounded lives, one human, one wild, were beginning their slow and silent drift toward each other. The forest outside seemed unusually still. The sanctuary, too. As if the world held its breath in the quiet space between what had been lost and what was just starting to be found. What no one knew, not Lily, not Dr. Bennett, not even the seasoned staff moving through the dim hallways, was that Sable had already sensed something. Before the kitten's cry reached human ears, it had reached hers. And by morning, the first subtle signs of an impossible bond would begin to surface. If you've ever felt a connection you couldn't explain, something small that stayed with you, keep listening. You may recognize a part of yourself in what happens next. The lights inside Willowcrest Sanctuary were dimmed for the night, but the building never truly slept. There was always a soft hum, the incubators, the heaters, the quiet shuffle of someone finishing a late feeding. And on this night, as the snow settled thick against the windows, something else moved through the halls. A sense of waiting, a sense of change. No one expected a newborn kitten to survive a night like this, and no one imagined that a grieving bobcat would be the first to sense his arrival. When Lily and her grandmother stepped inside, the warmth of the sanctuary wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. Dr. Bennett moved with the kind of calm that comes from years of watching fragile lives hover between staying and slipping away. He slid the tiny kitten, now named Noodle, into the incubator, adjusting the settings with gentle precision. A touch here, a check there. Hands steady, voice low. For a moment, all anyone could hear was the faint ticking of the wall clock and the kitten's tiny breaths, each one quivering like a match flame in the wind. Willowcrest Sanctuary had always tried to stretch itself beyond what seemed possible. The team cared for everything from barn owls, grounded by storms, to mule deer hit along back roads. And always in the background, there was the quiet pressure from wildlife authorities, urging them to stay in their lane, to limit intake, to avoid stepping into cases deemed too complicated. It was a tension that weighed heavily on the staff, though they rarely spoke of it. Yet when a life showed up on their doorstep, even if it was just a kitten, the question wasn't should they take him, but how to give him the best chance. Noodle's body was still dangerously cold. His paws were stiff from the hours spent outside. His heartbeat fluttered like a tiny bird caught between branches. While Dr. Bennett worked, Lily lingered in the corner, arms wrapped around her chest. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The room seemed to understand her silence as an echo of something deeper, a love that had been interrupted too soon, and a hope she was afraid to claim. But in another wing of the sanctuary, an entirely different heart was stirring. Down the hallway, behind a row of sturdy enclosure doors, Sable lay in her bedding. For days, she had barely moved. The straw beneath her was still neatly shaped, as if holding the memory of the cub she had lost. Every so often, she lifted her head, sniffing at the air with a kind of cautious curiosity. The world had seemed faded since her arrival. Colors duller, sounds quieter, instincts softened into something like grief. But tonight, the faintest shift in the air reached her, a small sound, almost lost beneath the hum of equipment. Not loud, not clear, just a weak, wavering cry. It floated down the hall like a thread of emotion, and Sable's ears turned toward it. She rose slowly, carefully, as if she were afraid the world might break beneath her paws. She stepped closer to the front of her enclosure, pressing her nose to the cool metal bars. Her breath fogged the surface, then disappeared, and she listened. There are moments in life when something inside us, something bruised or quiet or tucked away, responds before we understand why. For many people, and for many animals too, loss creates a kind of echo. When we hear a familiar sound, a cry, a whisper, it resonates in places we didn't realize were still tender. For Sable, the sound of Noodle's mew was not just noise. It was a memory. It was instinct. It was the lingering shape of a mothering rhythm that hadn't fully faded. In sanctuaries like Willowcrest, the staff often talk about these subtle signs. The way a fox that lost a litter might sleep near orphaned pups. The way a doe might pace anxiously when a fawn cries from another enclosure. Kindness, love, loyalty, emotions. They don't belong only to humans, and sometimes they appear in the quietest, most unexpected ways. Most people imagine bobcats as fierce, solitary predators, lean bodies, sharp instincts, eyes that see what we cannot. And in many ways, that's true. But what gets overlooked is the softness woven into their biology. Bobcat mothers are remarkably tender with their young. They chirp, purr, groom, and guard with a devotion that rivals any storybook depiction of motherhood. Sable had been preparing for that journey. Her body knew it. Her instincts shaped themselves around it. And then, without warning, she was left with nothing but silence. Science explains some of this. Hormones, imprinting, maternal drive. But standing in the sanctuary at night, listening to a grief-stricken bobcat rise at the faint cry of a stray kitten, it's hard not to feel something deeper, something soulful. It reminds us that nature holds a kind of wisdom that defies tidy explanations. As Noodle rested in the incubator, Sable began pacing gently, tracing slow half circles. Not aggressive, not restless, just present. A mother without a baby without a mother. Their griefs, different as they were, seemed to recognize each other. Valeria Ortiz, one of the nighttime technicians, walked the hall with a clipboard tucked under her arm. She noticed Sable's movements immediately, slight but unusual. When she reported it to Dr. Bennett, he sighed softly. "We can't take on more right now," he murmured. The sanctuary had been audited the week before by wildlife authorities. Their message had been clear. Limit cross-species contact. Avoid imprinting. Don't intervene unless necessary. Everything had to be justified. But compassion rarely fits neatly into a checklist. "Just keep an eye on her," Dr. Bennett added. "Sometimes animals feel things we don't." Valeria nodded, even though the words left her thick with questions. She glanced toward the kitten, then toward Sable's enclosure. Something was happening there, something she couldn't explain. Sable inhaled deeply, catching the faint scent of warm milk drifting from the exam room. She blinked slowly, pupils dilating with curiosity. The soft mewling pulled at her like a distant voice calling her name. She lowered her head and let out a chirp, quiet, uncertain, the kind a mother uses to coax her hidden young into the open. No one in the sanctuary heard it, but the kitten did. Noodle's tiny, fragile ears twitched in the incubator, and Sable chirped again. By morning, her pacing had a rhythm. Her ears stayed tipped toward the hallway, and when Valeria walked by with the kitten's bottle, Sable pressed close to the bars, following every step. Something had begun, something gentle, unexpected, and stronger than instinct alone. And soon the staff would witness the first signs of a bond that would challenge everything they thought they knew about wild animals. If you've ever felt drawn to someone or something without knowing why, stay with this story. What unfolds next reminds us how quietly love can begin, even in the unlikeliest places. The first rays of morning touched the sanctuary with a muted gold, soft enough that they barely reached the corners of the hallways. Night had been long, and though storms had eased, the world outside still felt brittle. Cold branches, quiet fields, frozen earth waiting for the day to warm it back to life. Inside, though, something else was stirring. Something just as fragile, but far more alive. Before sunrise, two souls, one wild, one barely clinging to breath, began reaching toward each other without ever having met. And what guided them wasn't logic, it was longing. Noodle's incubator hummed beside Dr. Bennett's desk. The kitten's chest rose and fell with slow, uneven breaths, each one a small victory. His fur was still slightly damp from the warming pads, and when the heater cycled, he let out a faint, broken mew. Not loud enough to travel far, but enough. Down the corridor, Sable lifted her head immediately. She had spent most of the night awake, moving in and out of a restless rhythm that the staff hadn't seen in days. She paced, paused, listened. Every time the kitten made a sound, she seemed to feel it. Not with her ears alone, but somewhere deeper. Somewhere instinct still held a memory of the cub she'd lost. In the natural world, bobcat mothers are fiercely attentive. They memorize their baby's cries within hours. They respond to even the faintest shift in sound, scent, or movement. Maternal instinct is not a gentle whisper. It's a driving force, built into their bodies like breath. And when that instinct is awakened but has nowhere to go, grief settles in. Heavy, quiet, and all-consuming. Sable had carried that weight since the day she arrived at Willow Crest. She refused food. She turned away from enrichment toys. She slept with her nose pressed to the straw where her cub had been laid. The staff had grown used to checking on her with a kind of tender helplessness, unsure how to help a grieving mother whose loss they could not undo. But the moment Noodle came through their doors, that quiet ache shifted. The kitten didn't just need warmth or formula. He needed something that no incubator or medication could give him. A steady presence, a heartbeat, a sense that he wasn't alone in the world. And Sable, she needed something too. Valeria Ortiz was the first to notice it clearly. She was rounding the hall with Noodle's 6 a.m. feeding, her steps slow and careful so she wouldn't jostle the kitten. As she passed Sable's enclosure, she saw the bobcat leaning forward, ears fully upright for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't agitation. It was a focus. Sable's gaze followed the tiny bundle in Valeria's hands with a stillness that sent a shiver through her. Not fear. Something else. Something like recognition. Noodle let out a tiny cry, almost a squeak, barely sounds at all. Sable chuffed softly, a low, warm bobcat call used only for cubs. Valeria froze. There, in the quiet of a winter morning, stood a mother without a baby, and a baby without a mother. And the air between them felt charged with something gentle and unexpected, like a bridge forming out of thin air. She hurried to the exam room, but the memory of that moment stayed with her all day. There are times in life when two wounds recognize each other before the people around them do. Times when healing doesn't begin with words or care plans, but with the simple ache of one heart calling out to another. Older viewers often understand this intuitively. Loss can soften us. Loneliness can sharpen our senses. And sometimes, the very thing that hurts us most becomes the guide that draws us to someone who needs us just as deeply. Sable wasn't looking for a new come. She wasn't trying to replace what she'd lost. She was responding to something unexplainably tender. A small cry in a big, cold world. And Noodle, with his paper-thin breaths and trembling paws, was responding right back. Researchers have long known that maternal instincts in mammals don't follow neat categories. Under certain conditions, stress, loss, environmental shifts, wild animals can develop cross-species bonds, not because they forget who they are, but because certain emotions are universal. Comfort, warmth, safety, contact. Bobcats, despite their solitary nature, form profound attachments during motherhood. Their purring vibrates at frequencies believed to calm distress in young animals. Their chirps reassure. Their slow grooming teaches trust. So when Sable heard Noodle struggle for breath, or sensed something familiar in the air, it wasn't confusion. It was biology rising to the surface. It was compassion taking shape in a wild body. And when Noodle responded in turn, pressing his tiny paw weakly against the incubator wall, it was his first connection attempt, not to survive the night, but to find something he had never known: belonging. Later that morning, Dr. Bennett walked the hall with Gregory Hale, the head rehabilitator. They stopped outside Sable's enclosure as she paced her slow half-circle again. "Do you see this?" Gregory whispered. Dr. Bennett nodded, rubbing a tired hand over his face. "She hasn't moved like this since she lost the cub." "Do you think she knows?" Gregory asked. A long pause. Then Bennett sighed, his voice little more than a murmur. "I think she feels something, and sometimes that's more powerful than knowing." It was a gentle admission, one sanctuary staff often made when the line between instinct and emotion blurred. They had seen animals comfort one another after loss. They had seen unexpected kindness bloom between species that should have feared each other, and they had learned not to dismiss these moments as coincidence. Sometimes nature shows us truths our textbooks don't cover. After his morning feeding, Noodle shifted in his incubator, just enough to bring his nose close to one of the air vents. His whiskers quivered. His tiny eyes were still closed, but his body leaned toward something. Some scent, some warmth drifting through the room. It was the scent of straw, of fur, of a mother who had loved deeply enough to grieve. And though Noodle was too young to understand it, his tiny heartbeat steadied. By evening, it became impossible to ignore. Every cry Noodle made, Sable answered. Every time staff walked past her enclosure carrying the kitten's formula, she pressed against the bars as if trying to follow. Two separate lives, two separate losses, now circling each other like they were being drawn by something invisible. And soon the sanctuary would face a choice, a risky, controversial, deeply human choice that would change the course of both their futures. If you've ever seen two broken pieces find their way toward each other, you'll understand what comes next. Stay with the story. You may feel something settle quietly in your own heart as their paths begin to intertwine. Morning at Willow Crest always arrived gently, as if the sanctuary itself understood the need for slow beginnings. The sun rarely burst over the foothills. It eased across them, letting the light spill softly through the ponderosa pines. That kind of light felt like a kindness. It didn't rush anyone. It didn't demand anything. It simply offered warmth and waited for the animals and the people to wake when they were ready. On this particular morning, something else woke with the sun. Something subtle, but unmistakably alive. A shift, a new rhythm. A quiet connection is beginning to form in the stillness. The hallways of Willowcrest were cool at dawn, carrying the scent of pine shavings, warm milk, and the faint, earthy smell that clings to old wooden shelters. A few volunteers moved slowly, their footsteps soft. This was the kind of place where the day didn't start with alarms or bright lights. It started with listening to who needed help, listening for who was hungry, restless, frightened, or healing. Today, the first sound wasn't a hawk, or a deer, or a fox kit. It was Noodle's tiny cry. Barely audible, but to those who knew the sanctuary well, even the smallest cry mattered. A typical morning at Willowcrest unfolded in layers, checking incubators, warming bottles, cleaning enclosures, and tending to the patients that had arrived overnight. Many were wild. Some were domestic. A few were creatures caught in the complicated space between both worlds. But today, almost every staff member had the same thought flicker through their mind. Check on Sable, because yesterday, Sable, the sanctuary's grieving bobcat, had changed her patterns. She'd begun responding to Noodle's cries with soft chirps reserved for her own young. She had paced, watched, listened, and none of them had forgotten the way she pressed her body against the enclosure bars, as though trying to close the distance between her and the little orphaned kitten. So as the day began, the sanctuary's usual routine included something new. Quiet anticipation. Valeria Ortiz was the first to reach Sable's wing that morning. She pushed the door open slowly so it wouldn't creak, the same way you move when approaching someone deep in thought. The light drifted in behind her, washing the bobcat's enclosure in a warm amber glow. What she saw made her pause mid-step. Sable was already awake, sitting upright, ears tilted forward, eyes fixed on the direction of the exam room, the same direction from which Noodle's latest faint cry had come. There were no signs of agitation, no tension, just presence. "Good morning, girl," Valeria whispered. Sable didn't turn. She stayed facing the hallway, her breathing steady, her posture calm. If anything, she seemed to soften at the sound of the human voice, as though she recognized the morning ritual, but had something more pressing on her mind. Valeria followed her gaze. Down the hall, Dr. Bennett was warming Noodle's bottle, humming under his breath, a simple tune he didn't know he hummed every morning. Noodle stirred in his incubator, releasing another small plea. It wasn't loud, it wasn't urgent, but it traveled straight to Sable, and Sable answered with a chuff. Soft, low, maternal. Valeria felt that sound in her chest before she heard it in her ears. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with bold choices or sudden breakthroughs. It begins in the quiet moments, the ones easy to overlook, unless your heart is tuned to them. A baby's first attempt to stretch its legs. A mother's instinct reaching out through grief. A staff member notices a tiny shift in posture. For many of us, especially those who have lived long enough to feel life's heavier weights, it's these understated gestures that stay with us. Not the dramatic scenes, but the gentle ones. The warmth of a morning sunbeam, the familiar scent of pine, the flutter of hope when you see something small trying to live. Noodle wasn't supposed to inspire anything more than concern that morning, but he did. His fragile cry touched Sable in a place deeper than survival, and deeper than instinct alone. And watching that unfold began touching the staff too. They found themselves moving through the halls with quieter footsteps, speaking in softer tones, almost as if the sanctuary itself was adjusting to the fragile thread connecting these two. Most people imagine predator species waking with sharp focus, ready to hunt, ready to defend, ready to survive. But a maternal bobcat in a sanctuary moves differently. Sable didn't greet the morning with the alertness of a wildcat preparing for the day. She greeted it with a stillness shaped by longing. Her eyes weren't scanning for threats. They were searching for something familiar, something small, in need of comfort, something she lost, and something she felt returning in a new form. Science offers explanations here. Maternal hormones lingering after a stillbirth, heightened sensitivity to infant cries, the imprinting mechanisms that can be triggered across species in emotionally stressful contexts. But science can't fully explain why Sable sat there, motionless, waiting, or why her first vocalization of the day wasn't a warning or a greeting, but a reassurance, kindness and love. Even in the wild, sometimes slip into places no textbook can describe. And the staff felt it. Gregory Hale stopped mid-morning cleaning to stand beside Valeria, watching Sable as she watched the hallway. "She's different," Gregory murmured. "Yeah, I think she needs something. Maybe he does too." Gregory didn't reply. He didn't have to. Sometimes the truth doesn't need words. It's carried in the quiet recognition between people who understand the weight of loss. By noon, Noodle had taken several small feedings and rested with a little more strength than the day before. He was still frail, still dependent on the warm hum of his incubator, but his movements were different, slightly more deliberate, slightly more responsive, and every single time he made a sound, even the faintest mew, Sable reacted. At first, the staff assumed it was a coincidence, but by late afternoon they stopped doubting. Her ears always pivoted, her posture always rose, her gaze always locked toward the exam room with unwavering attention. It wasn't random. Something had formed between them, a thread woven from instinct, loneliness, and a kind of devotion that didn't belong in any guidebook about bobcats. By nightfall, the sanctuary's routine had changed completely. People checked on Sable every hour, not because they were worried about her behavior, but because they were witnessing the beginning of something rare, something precious, something that asked to be handled with reverence. Soon, the sanctuary would be faced with a decision that carried both risk and possibility, a decision that tested their training, their instincts, and their faith in the quiet wisdom of nature. Later, listen, because the bond between Sable and Noodle was no longer a question. It was a pull, gentle, persistent, undeniable, and the next step would change everything. If you've ever watched two lives slowly lean toward each other, carefully, instinctively, you know these quiet moments matter most. Stay with the story. The choice Willowcrest makes next will stay with you long after the video ends. The storm returned the next evening, quieter this time, but colder. One of those nights when the air carries a metallic sharpness, and the sanctuary's windows gather thin crystals of frost around the edges. The kind of cold that finds its way into every weakness, every crack, every living thing that doesn't have enough warmth left to fight it. And that night, as the temperature dropped and the lights flickered, a newborn kitten's life slipped toward the edge, until a wild bobcat mother made a choice no one could explain. Inside the exam room, Noodle was struggling. His temperature, once rising steadily, dipped without warning. His breaths became shallow, drawn out, fragile. The warm hum of the incubator no longer seemed enough. Every few minutes, he let out a faint cry, thin, weaker than before. It was the sound of a life losing its grip. "Doctor." Bennett leaned over him, adjusting the heat pad, switching to emergency formula, murmuring soft encouragements. But the kitten's tiny body didn't respond the way it had earlier. His paws twitched, his tail curled, his heartbeat fluttered like a candle flame in a draft. The staff knew this moment too well. Some animals rally, some don't. And the hardest part, always, is not knowing which way the night will go. But Sable, Sable seemed to know. Down the hall, the bobcat paced as if something inside her was unraveling. She moved from one end of her enclosure to the other, pausing only when Noodle cried. Each cry made her stop mid-step, made her press her body hard against the metal bars, made her chirp, low and urgent, the sound of a mother calling a cub in distress. It was the kind of call that could break a person open. The sanctuary had strict rules about cross-species contact, not because the staff lacked compassion, but because wildlife authorities required caution. A wild bobcat interacting with a domestic kitten. It raised concerns about imprinting, safety, disease transmission, and long-term behavior. The kind of concerns that made regulators uneasy and placed sanctuaries under scrutiny. And yet, science had reached its limit with Noodle. Technology had too. Warmers, incubators, fluids. They could only do so much. Sometimes, the most sophisticated tools fail. And that's when instinct takes over. Sable's maternal hormones were still active. Her grief had carved out a hollow space inside her. Her senses were heightened, her responsiveness unusually sharp. Everything in her biology was telling her, a baby is crying, a baby who needs me. And everything in Noodle's tiny, struggling body was crying out for warmth, contact, steady breath, a heartbeat stronger than his own. As the storm worsened, the sanctuary's old generator flickered, lights dimming for a few seconds before stabilizing. But those few seconds were enough to drop the incubator temperature. Noodle's cry weakened into a half sound. Valeria looked at Dr. Bennett with the kind of expressions sanctuary workers share only in the hardest moments. "We're losing him," she whispered. Before Dr. Bennett could answer, a sudden thud echoed from down the corridor, loud enough to draw both their attention. Then another and another. Sable was throwing her weight against the enclosure wall. Not violently, not aggressively, but with urgency, with purpose. Her pacing had stopped. Her calls had changed. Now she was pressing herself so hard against the bars that her ribs expanded with each breath, as though she was trying to warm something just beyond her reach. Valeria's voice trembled. "She knows. She hears him." Dr. Bennett closed his eyes for a moment, not out of fear, but out of the kind of heaviness that comes when a decision carries more than one truth. Then, in a tone barely above a whisper, he said, "Bring his incubator closer." It wasn't protocol. It wasn't recommended. It wasn't approved. But it was human. There are moments in life when rules feel too small for the situation in front of us. When doing everything correctly doesn't feel right. When the need for connection, for warmth, for kindness rises above logic. For people who've suffered loss, who've held fragile lives in their hands, whether children, grandchildren, pets, or aging loved ones, this moment rings with familiarity. It's the moment when instinct whispers, "Do something," even when you don't know what will work. The staff at Willowcrest were no strangers to grief. They had seen animals die in their arms. They had buried rescues that never learned what safety felt like. So there, in the glow of the storm-darkened hallway, they made a choice that wasn't scientific, but deeply human. Research shows that the warmth and rhythmic purring of a mother cat can stabilize an infant's heart rate and breathing. The vibration frequencies, between 25 and 150 hertz, are known to promote healing in bones and soft tissues. Bobcats purr at these same frequencies. Their bodies, larger and stronger, create vibrations even deeper. But what mattered most wasn't the science. It was this. A grieving mother was calling for a baby in distress. A dying baby was reaching for the warmth he had never known. Gregory wheeled the incubator towards Sable's enclosure, careful to keep the door locked. careful to maintain a safe barrier. But as soon as the incubator reached the front of her pen, something extraordinary happened. Sable stopped pushing the walls. She stopped pacing. She lowered herself to the floor and pressed her entire body against the metal bars, her warmth seeping out, her breath steadying. She began to purr. The sound was deep, slow, grounding, like distant thunder rolling across a valley. And within minutes, Noodle's breathing steadied. His heartbeat evened out. His body stopped trembling. He curled, as if instinctively drawn toward the sound that felt like safety. For the first time all night, the kitten rested without gasping. And Sable, she didn't move. Not for hours. She remained pressed against the bars like a guardian, her eyes soft, her chest rising and falling in a calming rhythm. It was devotion, unmistakably. Dr. Bennett stood in the doorway, emotion gathering in his throat. "I don't know what this is," he murmured, "but it's happening." What began as a desperate attempt to save a life soon revealed something even deeper, because by the next sunrise, Sable wouldn't just be warming the kitten from a distance. She would begin caring for him, even through the barriers. And the sanctuary, once cautious, would find itself moved by something too remarkable to ignore. Their bond had only begun. If you've ever witnessed a moment when pure instinct stepped in where reason fell short, you'll understand what comes next. Stay with the story. The most beautiful part is about to unfold. By the time the next morning settled over Willowcrest, the storm clouds had thinned into a pale mist, soft enough that the first rays of sunlight slipped through like quiet reassurance. The sanctuary always woke slowly, but today the stillness held something different, something fuller, something tender. Because sometimes in the night, between the humming incubator and the low, steady purr of a grieving bobcat, two lives had settled into the same rhythm. At dawn, the staff found something no textbook had prepared them for: a wild bobcat, pressed protectively against the bars of her enclosure, and a fragile kitten sleeping peacefully for the first time in his short life, only inches away, separated only by glass and metal, yet somehow closer than anyone could explain. Noodle hadn't crashed again during the night. His breathing, once erratic, had matched the cadence of Sable's purrs. His heartbeat steadied, his body relaxed. It was as if he had borrowed her strength just long enough to find his own. And Sable, she had remained exactly where she'd settled hours before, her body curved around the edge of the enclosure wall, her fur pressed to the cold metal, as if she could warm the kitten through sheer devotion. When the staff arrived, they didn't speak at first. Some moments feel sacred, and this was one of them. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged, one so clear, so consistent, that even the most cautious among the team had to acknowledge it. Whenever Noodle cried, Sable chirped back. Whenever he stirred, she pressed closer. Whenever staff carried him past her enclosure, she followed with her eyes, step for step, breath for breath. And it wasn't random. Bobcat maternal instinct is powerful, especially in a mother who has recently experienced loss. Their hormones linger. Their senses stay sharp for weeks. They remain attuned to the calls of infants, even across species. But what Willowcrest was witnessing went beyond biology. It had an emotional resonance that every staff member could feel the moment they walked into the hall. It was as if the sanctuary itself had fallen into a slower rhythm to make room for the connection blooming between these two. 3 days after the storm, Valeria carried Noodle for his bottle feeding. The kitten squirmed softly in her hands, still small, still fragile, but livelier. As she approached Sable's enclosure, the bobcat rose and pressed her forehead against the bars, emitting a series of soft chirps that sounded almost like reassurance. Valeria paused. "Sable, he's okay," she whispered, even though she knew the bobcat didn't understand words the way humans do. But Sable understood tone. She understood presence. She understood that the tiny life she'd been guarding from a distance was still here. The kitten let out a small cry. Not distressed, just hungry. And something extraordinary happened. Sable's purr deepened, turning into a rolling vibration that filled the entire enclosure. Noodle froze mid-cry. Then he relaxed. His body softened against Valeria's hands, his breathing slowing, as if he were leaning into the resonance. It was the kind of moment that made Valeria swallow hard. "Do you see this?" she murmured, glancing toward Gregory, who had just stepped into the hall. He did. They all did. This wasn't a chance. It wasn't a series of coincidences. It was a relationship taking shape, a bond forming quietly in the middle of winter, between two lives that had both lost something precious. Something is stirring about witnessing affection where you least expect it. Something that reaches into the softest parts of us, especially as we get older, and life has shown us just how fragile love can be. The staff at Willowcrest were no strangers to hardship. They'd seen sickness, injury, cruelty, and tragedy. They'd patched up countless animals, only to say goodbye before they were ready. But they kept doing the work, because every now and then, something miraculous happened, something that reminded them why compassion matters. Watching Sable and Noodle was like watching two broken pieces drift slowly toward each other, guided not by logic, but by need. And the staff, each in their own way, felt that need too. It wasn't just a kitten being saved. It was a mother finding purpose again. It was a sanctuary, rediscovering hope. When scientists speak about animal behavior, they often emphasize survival, instinct, and biological programming. And those things matter. They shape much of what animals do. But there is a growing body of research that explores cross-species caregiving. Cases where animals respond to infants, not their own. Cases where grief reshapes behavior. Cases where emotional memory drives unexpected connections. What Willowcrest was seeing mirrored some of those findings. Sable responded not only to Noodle's cries, but to his scent. Her purring regulated his fragile nervous system. Her maternal instincts, though misplaced by circumstance, had sharpened. Noodle's improvement corresponded directly with her presence. This wasn't just imprinting. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't an outlier to dismiss. It was compassion showing up in a wild animal, gently, instinctively, beautifully. And for the staff, many of whom had spent years trying to explain the unexplainable parts of nature, it felt like a reminder. Love doesn't always follow rules. Loyalty doesn't always follow logic. And healing can come from places we never expect. Over the next week, the staff found themselves lingering a little longer outside Sable's enclosure, not because they were worried about her behavior, but because she had become a symbol of quiet strength. Gregory admitted one morning, "I didn't know she had this much tenderness in her. I thought we'd lost her after the stillbirth." Dr. Bennett nodded, his voice gentle. Maybe she just needed someone to need her. Even Lily, who visited whenever she could, stood silently in awe. The grief she'd carried since losing Milo felt a little lighter each time she watched Sable lean close to the kitten. It reminded her of something she thought she'd forgotten. Love doesn't end. It changes shape. It finds new places to land. Sometimes in the most unexpected ways. But as days passed, something else began to happen. Something that could no longer be dismissed as surface-level curiosity. Sable didn't only react to Noodle's cries. She started trying to care for him through the bars. She tried to groom him. Tried to cover him with scraps of straw she pulled from her bedding. Tried to adjust his blankets with her teeth when Valeria held him too far from the incubator. Instinct was no longer whispering. It was asking for more. It was asking the mother. And soon, Willowcrest would have to decide whether to honor that instinct or hold the world apart for the sake of safety. A choice was coming. A difficult one. A brave one. If you've ever watched two beings find comfort in each other, especially after loss, you know how rare and precious it is. Stay with this story, because the moment that comes next will mark the beginning of their true bond. By spring, the snow around Willowcrest had melted into soft patches of earth, and the first shoots of green pushed through the cold soil. The sanctuary always felt different in spring, lighter, almost hopeful, as if the land itself remembered how to breathe again. But that particular spring brought a shift unlike any the staff had ever witnessed. A shift not in weather, but in the two lives that had become the quiet heart of the sanctuary. Noodle, once a trembling newborn, now moved with cautious confidence. He wasn't fully grown, and his gait still carried the slight wobble of a cat who had known fragility too closely. But he was healthy. He was steady. And in his own gentle way, he had begun to adopt some of Sable's mannerisms. Her careful crouch, her alert ears, her patient pauses before crossing a room, and Sable watched him with a tenderness that no one questioned anymore. But no one, not even the staff who had seen miracles unfold step by step, was prepared for the moment when Noodle, the tiny orphan who once needed saving, chose to become the protector instead. It began on an April afternoon, warm enough that the sanctuary opened several of the outer enclosures to let fresh air move through the corridors. The breeze carried the scent of pine bark and damp soil. Birds chattered from the trees above, creating a soundtrack so familiar that staff often talked over it without ever noticing its comfort. Sable and Noodle were in their shared viewing area, a space separated by secure partitions, but designed so bonded or recovering animals could remain close to those who calmed them. Noodle was sprawled in a sunbeam, eyes half closed, while Sable rested just a few feet away, her tail flicking lazily against the ground. Then the call came in. 3 orphaned bobcat kits had been found beneath an old ranch shed, eyes barely open, cold, hungry, confused. Their mother had been struck by a vehicle overnight. The local ranger delivered them in a small carrier, bundled in towels. Willowcrest was quiet for a long moment when the door opened. The kind of quiet that comes when grief circles back and touches old wounds. Sable lifted her head. Her ears sharpened. Her posture changed. Her breath caught in her chest, then deepened, slow and steady. The way she used to breathe when she listened for Noodle's cries. Orphaned wildlife kits often struggle most in their first 48 hours without a mother. Their chances improve dramatically when placed with an adult female of their species. But Sable was not just any adult female. She was a bobcat who had already adopted a kitten from another species. A bobcat who had experienced the joy and the heartbreak of motherhood in unequal measure. The staff knew they couldn't place the kits directly with her. Not yet. Not with her history. And not without a proper assessment. But they didn't have to initiate anything. Sable initiated it herself. She rose slowly, approached the partition, and chuffed. A soft, coaxing sound she had once reserved only for Noodle. And to everyone's surprise, Noodle responded first. Noodle stood up on unsteady legs and walked toward the carrier. His movements were hesitant, cautious, in that instinctive way animals move when they sense fragile life nearby. He sniffed the air, heart-shaped nose twitching. Then he did something no one expected. He sat beside the carrier, not pawing, not playing, just sitting, present, steady. And when one of the bobcat kits let out a thin, frightened cry, Noodle leaned in gently, pressing his forehead to the plastic door. He didn't meow. He didn't chirp. He simply stayed, offering something rare for a domestic cat raised in a sanctuary. Confidence. Sable watched him with slow, blinking eyes, an expression the staff had come to recognize as her version of pride. Gregory Hale whispered, "He's doing exactly what she did for him." It was true. Noodle, the kitten who once survived because a bobcat mother steadied her breath to calm his, was now doing the same for the next generation. A life saved, becoming a life that saves. There's something deeply comforting about watching kindness flow in circles. It reminds us that nothing we give from the heart disappears. It comes back in ways we don't expect. through people or animals who surprise us, in moments that make the world feel gentle again.
Many viewers, especially those who've lived long enough to see life repeat itself in cycles, understand this instinctively.
We care for our children, and later, they care for us. We tend to the sick, and somewhere down the road, someone tends to us.
We offer comfort in the hope that it keeps traveling.
Noodle and Sable's story had always been one of survival, but now it was becoming a lesson in reciprocity, in legacy, in love that deepens as it passes from one life to another. Biologists describe this kind of behavior as cross-species empathy. It's rare, but documented, moments when an animal's emotional intelligence extends beyond instinct. A cat raising ducklings, a dog nursing orphaned goats, a wolf guarding a lost human child in remote woods. But what Willowcrest saw was more than a behavioral quirk. It was learned compassion. Noodle had been shaped by Sable's protection, by her watchfulness, by her gentle insistence that he was worth saving.
His mimicry wasn't just physical, he was copying her care.
That afternoon, he remained near the bobcat kits until the staff moved them into a warm enclosure for monitoring. He settled himself beside Sable afterward, and for the first time, pressed his small body against hers without hesitation. It was his way of saying, "I understand now. I'm with you." Over the next several days, the kits stabilized. They fed more easily, cried less often, and responded to Sable's low purrs from across the room. And Noodle? He became their quiet guardian. Every time the kits mewled, Noodle approached their enclosure, sat nearby, and waited until they calmed. His presence seemed to reassure them, maybe because it mirrored Sable's strength, maybe because it felt familiar, or maybe because compassion doesn't need matching species to be understood. At one point, Valeria whispered to Dr. Bennett, "I think he believes he's a bobcat." Dr. Bennett smiled softly. "I think he believes he's doing what he was taught." But as the connection deepened between Noodle, Sable, and the new kits, something else began to grow too. A truth that no one at Willowcrest could ignore anymore. This wasn't just a bond. It wasn't just healing. It wasn't just instinct. It was family. And soon, the world outside the sanctuary would see it too, in a moment that would redefine what love looks like in the natural world. If you've ever been cared for, and later found yourself caring for someone else in the same tender way, you'll understand why this next chapter matters. Stay with the story. Their most beautiful moment is still ahead. By early summer, Willowcrest no longer felt like the same sanctuary. Not because the buildings had changed, or the routines, or even the long list of animals who still required constant care. It had changed because something gentle had taken root there. Something that reminded every person who walked through the doors that compassion is not limited to our day, species alone. It lives in the wild too, in quiet ways that defy everything we think we know. And the moment that revealed this most clearly came one warm evening when the mountains glowed in shades of gold, and a bobcat and a white domestic cat settled side by side, in a way no one thought possible. Not as exceptions to nature, but as proof of what love can make nature become. Throughout the season, staff had grown accustomed to finding Sable and Noodle curled close together, separated only by the mesh doors designed to keep them safe. But that evening, when the air was soft and full of pine, they lay in a shared viewing space, still partitioned by protective barriers, yet unmistakably connected. The new bobcat kits slept nearby in a warmed enclosure, full-bellied and peaceful. Noodle watched over them with the kind of solemn attention he once received. Every so often he looked back at Sable, and she answered with a slow blink. The same blink she gave him when he was a newborn, trembling in an incubator. The sanctuary was quiet. Even the birds seemed to soften their calls, as though something sacred was unfolding, and the world needed to hush. Stories like this rarely fit into scientific frameworks.
not completely. Researchers can explain hormones, imprinting, environmental triggers, and the biological roots of maternal instinct. They can describe why a bobcat responds to infant cries, or why a domestic kitten might mimic behaviors from the animal who raised him. But what they can't explain, what none of us can fully measure, is the emotional echo that forms between two beings who've known loss. Love, loyalty, healing. These are concepts science can study, but not define in their entirety. At Willow Crest, the staff eventually accepted that Sable and Noodle were not anomalies or puzzles to solve. They were companions. They were family. They were two souls who found each other at their most vulnerable, and somehow built something stronger than the instincts that should have divided them. The moment that sealed their place in the hearts of everyone at the sanctuary came just after sunset. Shadows stretched long across the ground. The scent of sage drifted through the open windows, and in one of the outdoor runs, a sudden rattle sounded, the alert clang of a nearby feeding station accidentally tipping over. The noise startled the bobcat kits, who woke with sharp cries. They scrambled to the corner of their enclosure, frightened in the way only the very young can be. Instantly, fully, overwhelmingly. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but stayed with every witness for years. Sable rose with a low, steady purr meant to soothe. She pressed as close as the barriers allowed, her posture strong, her gaze focused on the frightened kits. But before she reached them, Noodle moved first. He slipped to their enclosure, calm, steady, grounded. He pressed his small body against the wire, lowering his head until it rested beside the trembling cluster of young bobcats. He didn't meow. He didn't panic. He did what Sable once did for him. He stayed. He offered warmth. He became safe. And the kits responded instantly. Their cries softened. Their breathing settled. One of them reached out a tiny paw toward him, barely touching the mesh, as if recognizing something familiar. Something they had felt since the day they arrived. Sable watched him with the softness of a mother who sees her child take a step she once feared they'd never have the strength for. In that moment, grief, survival, instinct, nurture, they tangled into something larger, something beautiful, something the staff later described as a circle of protection. Life has a way of bringing our stories full circle when we least expect it. Many of us learn over the years that what we receive in our most vulnerable moments becomes part of what we give back. Pain transforms into empathy. Loneliness opens the door to understanding. And the love that once saved us becomes the love we offer others. Sable lost her baby. Noodle lost his mother. Two broken beginnings. Two hearts carrying quiet echoes of pain. But together, they built something new. Not a replacement, not a substitute, but a continuation. A soft reminder that healing doesn't cancel out what we've lost. It expands what we are capable of giving. Older viewers especially know this truth well. After decades of navigating life's storms, losing parents, pets, partners, friends, we learn that love doesn't disappear. It shifts. It returns. It finds new places to land, and sometimes it returns through unlikely pairings. A wild bobcat and an orphaned kitten sharing warmth. A domestic cat, comforting the young of a species he could never become. 2. Lives proving that compassion doesn't obey boundaries. It creates new ones. By the end of the season, Willow Crest kept receiving visitors, biologists, volunteers, even retired wildlife officers who came to observe the pair. Each one brought their expectations, assumptions, and theories. But most left quieter than they arrived, because Sable and Noodle didn't behave like subjects of a study. They behaved like a family. Noodle would often curl into the crook of Sable's enclosure fence, where she could lower her head and brush her cheek close. She never used her claws. She never expressed dominance. She treated him the way she treated her own lost cub, with a depth of emotion that no research paper could fully quantify. And he, in return, carried her lessons forward. The kits began mirroring his calmness. They trusted him before they trusted humans. They watched him as he watched Sable, learning not just how to survive, but how to feel safe. In many ways, Sable didn't just adopt Noodle. She taught him how to love, and he used that love to raise the next generation. That is the emotional payoff. That is the miracle. That is the heart of the story. Not that a bobcat saved a kitten. Not that a kitten comforted bobcat kits, but that two broken lives, meeting by chance, rewrote what we believe about nature's limits and about our own. Before you go, take a moment to turn this story inward. Think about someone, human or animal, who showed up for you in a hard season. Someone who offered warmth when you felt cold, or comfort when you felt lost. Let their memory settle softly in your heart. If this story brought you even a little hope, a little gentleness, or a reminder that love can appear in unexpected places, I invite you to like this video and subscribe. It helps this sanctuary of stories reach more people who need a moment of quiet healing. And if you feel moved to go one step further, you can tap Super Thanks or donate below to help rescue and heal wild animals like Sable, and give orphan babies like Noodle a chance not just to survive, but to be loved.